Hello and welcome back to Psychology 303, the analysis of everyday behavior. I'm Dr. Williams, and this is the series of the lectures for Chapter 6, punishment, positive and negative punishment. So let me begin by defining what a punisher actually is. So a true punisher is an aversive stimulus that will decrease the frequency of any behavior that produces it. It'll decrease frequency, magnitude, the strength of the behavior, the likelihood that you'll use it in the future. Whenever a behavior produces something aversive, we're unlikely to repeat it. Punishers are the exact same aversive stimuli that you would work to escape or avoid. So if we don't escape them and if we don't avoid them, then the behavior that produces them typically will decrease in some way. So true punishment, positive punishment, is a procedure in which that aversive stimulus or that punisher is presented contingent on the target behavior. So the target behavior occurs and we present the aversive stimulus, and the behavior that produces the aversive stimulus decreases, again, in frequency, in magnitude, strength, or probability. And aversive punishers are aversive stimuli that tell us when we're doing something that's unwanted or ineffective or even dangerous. Now, the contingencies associated with punishment, the ABCs of punishment, are the same as they are for reinforcement, except for the consequence. So we have an antecedent, something that provides us with a cue or a prompt to behave in a certain way. That produces the behavior, and the behavior is followed now not by a reinforcer, but rather by a punisher. So if we were to break down positive reinforcement versus punishment, you would see that in both cases, reinforcement and punishment involve the presentation of a stimulus. However, in reinforcement, that stimulus is appetitive. It's something we would work to earn. And in punishment, it's something aversive, something we don't like, something that we don't enjoy, something painful, something unpleasant. And the presentation of an appetitive stimulus following behavior should strengthen that behavior. And the presentation of an aversive stimulus following behavior should weaken that behavior. Now, this slide is going to describe the difference between negative reinforcement and punishment, and this is one that many people often confuse. They think that negative reinforcement actually is punishment, but remember that any time you're talking about a form of reinforcement, you're talking about strengthening behavior. Punishment, on the other hand, weakens behavior. So in negative reinforcement, what we're doing is we're removing an aversive stimulus following a behavior. So an aversive stimulus is already there, it's present, this is escape, and the behavior effectively causes that aversive stimulus to go away. Whatever we did to make the aversive stimulus go away is likely to be strengthened, so that behavior will become stronger. Punishment, on the other hand, we're also using an aversive stimulus, but now we're presenting that aversive stimulus contingent on behavior, and that will ultimately lead to weakening the behavior that produces it. So there are lots of different kinds of naturally occurring punishment in the world, and I have lots of examples. One of them is a toddler playing with a ball in the front yard. The ball bounces into the street, and what does the parent or the caregiver do? They scream, they run out in the street, they grab the child, they terrify the child. It's a scary moment when the parent freaks out. And so the next day, the ball bounces in the street, and the child starts toward the ball and then stops dead in their tracks, and they turn around and they look at the parent like, are you going to do that again? So that presentation of a punisher reduces the likelihood that the child will run in the street the next day under the same circumstances. Eating too much pecan pie. If you eat so much of something that it makes you sick, the next time you are offered a piece of pie or whatever that thing is, you're less likely to want it. When I was pregnant with my daughter, I was a type 2 diabetic, and I was in Atlanta. I went to a conference in Atlanta, and I wasn't supposed to eat sweet things at all, but I was like, I'll be darned if I'm not going to go to the South and not have some pecan pie. And so I had just the tiniest little slice of pecan pie. I was sick all night. Pecan pie used to be my favorite dessert. I'm not even interested. It had a powerful, powerful effect on my desire to eat, my motivation to eat pecan pie. Backing up without checking the rearview mirror. If you ever hit somebody, you're probably never going to back up without looking in the rearview mirror again. Those of you who are athletes, if you don't warm up and you run, you're going to learn that in the future, running without warming up is probably not a good idea. If you blow off studying before a big exam and you fail, and maybe it causes you to fail a class, you're probably not going to do that again. You're probably not going to go to a party right before a test or whatever. For me, it's public humiliation for loving David Cassidy. I'm totally embarrassed. He is the Justin Bieber of the 1970s. I'm totally embarrassed. Sorry about that. Okay. What about in your world? Positive punishment in your world. Now, you have to be very careful when I ask you about positive punishment in your world for you. What are those occasions when you've experienced punishment? Because you can't give me examples of negative punishment. I want examples of positive punishment. So you can't talk about being put on restriction or having your car keys taken away or having your privileges restricted. I really want to see only aversive consequences contingent on behavior. So you might want to stop this here and make a couple quick notes of examples of true punishment that you've experienced in your life. All right. There are lots of examples of punishment, some of them from the real world, some from examples from clinical settings. And so I want to talk a little bit about some examples, and you can check to see whether or not your examples match up with these kinds of examples. So in the laboratory, we might use mild electric shock to tell a rat that he's not supposed to press the lever anymore. Physical exercise for class disruptions. I have a former student who works in a now she works in special ed, but she used to work in a regular ed class as a paraprofessional working with special ed kids. And so when they were mainstreamed into certain classes, the kids with special needs would go into the main classes and they would have difficulty concentrating or behaving appropriately. And so one of her jobs was to keep this little boy on task. And one of her punishments was to use what they call contingent exercise. So she informed him that if he continued disrupting the class, he would have to go out into the hall and do jumping jacks with her. And she was very young and very attractive. And this little boy, I think it was middle school, he just loved her. He thought she was wonderful. And he thought, oh, you mean if I misbehave, I can go out and be alone with her. And of course, he was thinking of playing and doing fun things. And so the next day he came in and he disrupted the class, and she took him out and she made him do jumping jacks and sit-ups. And he did not like it. At first he thought it was funny, but then the second time it happened, it was less funny, and the third time it was less fun. And by the end of the first day, he did not want to misbehave because he knew that he would be taken out and be made. She wasn't going to play with him. She was going to make him do exercise. And so it decreased his disruptions. Being reprimanded for coming late to class. I don't know if I told you guys this story before, but in my learning class, the professor announced that no one should be late to class, and that he really meant it, and that if you were late to class, he wanted you to wait until the break and then come in. And so probably the end of the first week or the beginning of the second week, a guy came in late to class. He interrupted the entire lecture. It was a huge lecture hall, and so he climbs up the stairs. As he walks through the door, he's like, sorry, I didn't mean to be late. And he walks up the stairs and he starts moving toward a seat in the center. Excuse me, pardon me, sorry, excuse me. And the teacher stops lecturing and he's watching him as he goes. You could have heard a pin drop in the classroom. All you could hear was this guy going, excuse me, excuse me. And he gets to his seat, he sits down, he doesn't even look up. He starts rummaging around in his backpack and finally comes up with his notebook and his pencil, and he zips his backpack, puts it aside, sits down and looks up, and the whole class is staring at him. And the teacher said, you need to leave. And he was like, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to be late and I didn't mean to interrupt you. And he said, no, I'm serious. You need to leave. And he basically threw the kid out of class. And needless to say, he was never late to class again. But about a week later, I had trouble finding parking and I was late to class. And we learn really well through observing others. And I sat outside the classroom next to the open door taking notes, just listening until the break, and then I came in because I was not going to be thrown out of class. There's a great study where a young girl with multiple disabilities was grinding her teeth, and she had ground her teeth so hard that she had worn off the top teeth all the way to the gums, and the bottom teeth were severely damaged. And they had tried, she was blind, she was deaf, she was in a wheelchair, she had intellectual challenges. I mean, she was really a very challenged young girl. And they had tried many times to eliminate this tooth grinding, and it was audible, you could hear it, and the staff didn't want to work with her because she was crying all the time because her mouth hurt. And so a young graduate student came in, and as part of his thesis, he kept a bucket of ice next to her. Whenever she would grind her teeth, he would put an ice cube on her forehead. And she didn't like it. It was startling. She couldn't see where it was coming from, so it was startling. And in less than a day, he eliminated the behavior because the tooth grinding now, it used to, self-stimulatory in nature, but now the punisher it's really not a big punisher. I mean, an ice cube on your forehead isn't that big of a deal, but she didn't like it, and it stopped immediately. Similarly, another client, this is a very well-known study, was engaging in oral digital behavior. She would take her entire hand and make a little point with all of her fingers and shove her hand all the way into her mouth up to her knuckles. She had scarred her hand. They were covered with cuts and bites, and she couldn't interact with people. And so, similar to the ice cube treatment, the staff was trained to use a plant mister on mist, not spray, on mist. And again, she was severely disabled, blind, and so when she would put her hand in her mouth, there would be a gentle spray of water toward her face. And not up close, just from far away, but suddenly she would get this mist of water in her face. And one day, the behavior's gone. It's quite amazing. So your examples of punishment should be the contingent presentation of something unpleasant. So a behavior of yours that produces an unpleasant task or an unpleasant activity that you don't enjoy, that you're less likely to do in the future because it produces this unpleasant consequence. Now, well-devised punishment is important. Having a punishment contingency means that you have planned it out, that this is a thoughtful use of punishment, not just a last-minute slap, quote-unquote, slap in the face. You have to really have a contingent, a plan, a reinforcement contingency in the background to go along with any punishment that you have. So you really have to thought through what are those circumstances that will produce this punishment, and once the behavior stops, what am I going to start reinforcing to replace that behavior? By itself, punishment does not establish a new and more appropriate pattern of behavior. By itself, it only tells us what we've done wrong. It doesn't teach us what behaviors we can use to replace that incorrect response. And if the individual doesn't have a wealth of alternative behaviors available to them, then it falls to you as the intervention specialist to be prepared to teach and offer and train a more acceptable alternative behavior so that they can engage in an appropriate response rather than engaging in the punished response. Excuse me. Now, it's also important that we, and this is related to what I spoke about previously, punishment should never be used in anger. Often what happens in the real world is that we tolerate the misbehavior, and we tolerate the misbehavior, and we tolerate the misbehavior until we become very angry, and then we lash out in anger. And the punisher is the punishment, the procedure punishment, is really the result of our anger and our frustration with another person or individual, and not designed to suppress the behavior of the person misbehaving, but rather to express our anger. So if you're too angry, then don't use punishment. You have to walk away, take a breather, calm down, and then deal with the behavior. Punishment should never, ever be used in anger. It should be a planned therapeutic intervention with reinforcement for alternative behaviors already waiting and planned out to be used. Punishment, the procedure of punishment is a behavioral intervention for misbehavior. It is not the same as expressing your anger or expressing your frustration with someone else's behavior. Punishment needs to be planned. This is a skill. Not everybody is good at using punishment effectively, and in fact, even when it's done correctly, it's very easy for it not to be effective because there are so many mistakes that you can use in using punishment. So some of the side effects of using punishment. So when you decide that you're going to use punishment, you have to be prepared for these side effects that will creep up in the process. So the first one is that you will get emotionality and aggression from your client. You may see displacement of aggression. So when parents use corporal punishment on their children, you'll often see the children become emotional, they cry, and they may become aggressive. So a child who's been spanked may turn around and abuse the dog, or bite their little brother, or push a little kid out on the playground, push him down on the ground. So you'll see rates of aggression increase following the use of punishment. So you have to make sure that you don't use it very often because you're going to get increasing amounts of emotionality and aggression. So you have to pick your battles. It also, the use of punishment models the use of punishment. So children, there's a lot of research that shows children who are spanked will often aggress on younger children or on animals, on their pets. Because for them, it's an effective way to stop behavior. So while you think you are just punishing a behavior, you're also teaching them how to suppress behavior using punishment. And so you're likely to get, as a result, you're likely to get more of this aggression. Also, if it's not contingent on the behavior and it's not immediate, meaning there are no delays, it becomes less effective. Delaying a punisher has the result of reducing its strength and making it less effective. It's hard to connect the behavior to the punishment if they're separated in time. So you have to be careful. Now with older children, with adults, we can explain the relationship and they can learn the contingency and know that, yes, okay, I got in trouble and, you know, an hour later or a day later or a week later, I'm getting in trouble for that behavior that I engaged in previously. So they can learn that relationship. But with small children, people with disabilities, the elderly with dementia, with animals, you need to be immediate with your punishment. And it needs to be contingent on the behavior. The behavior that they're doing has to produce the punisher. It has to be reliable. It's also the case that a lot of people introduce punishers gradually. They'll start out small by saying, no, no, don't do that. And then they get a little more serious. I told you to stop. And then, hey, I said stop. And then it escalates to the point where they use severe punishment. And the interesting thing is that when you use the alternative is to use a fairly moderate but aversive stimulus once and suppress the behavior. The difference is you can punish the behavior once if the punishment's actually aversive, whereas with gradual introduction, it can escalate. It can grow gradually. And what we find is that people who are exposed to these mild punishers, initially like reprimands and stern faces, they habituate. And they learn, oh, well, I'm not really getting punished yet. And so they tend to wait until the punishment becomes effective, and as a result, the punishment it's necessary to escalate the punishment, and so it can lead to a more severe punishment than you would really need to use if you used a real punisher immediately, and sometimes it will even escalate to abuse. So you want to use sufficient intensity of the punisher from the very beginning to suppress the behavior immediately. Now, it doesn't have to be the most severe, but it needs to truly be aversive. And you can usually tell because people will object immediately, and they will show those responses of emotionality immediately. and you won't get that gradual increasing of that escalation of punishment. Let me go back here real quick. So I want to give you an example. Just you wait till your father gets home. So you have the finger wagging and the angry mother face and her stern voice. You've been bad. You did a bad thing. You just wait till your father gets home. All of that violates so many rules of punishment and creates so many side effects. It can create emotionality. It's not immediate. And what you're doing is you're starting out slow and then gradually increasing and over time. And so you're violating a lot of those rules and creating a lot of those side effects of being less effective or ineffective and creating emotionality and maybe even aggression. Now, this is just more of the same, more punishment side effects. Remember, too, that intermittent punishment really isn't intermittent punishment. We've talked about intermittent reinforcement. If you reinforce a behavior only occasionally, you're actually strengthening it because you're reinforcing the behavior and its persistence in the absence of reinforcement. When you use intermittent punishment, you are allowing the individual to get away with whatever that behavior is and earn the reinforcer until they finally get punished. And so it actually makes it hard to do punishment correctly, because you have to catch every instance of the behavior and punish it. Or they will learn under what circumstances they can get away with a behavior, or what environments they can get away with a behavior, and only suppress behaviors when they're likely to get caught. So you run into a lot of problems. The punishment's not very effective when you make it intermittent. The fact that it's intermittent, the fact that it's needs to be continuous reinforcement, continuous punishment, means that you are going to have to be there every time the behavior occurs. So it narrows the number of behaviors that you can use punishment on effectively. If you can be there the very first time a behavior occurs, and you can punish it immediately, you may be able to suppress it forever. But if this is an ongoing behavior, it happens in lots of environments, and you're not present part of the time, punishment may not be effective by itself. You may have to look at other kinds of interventions. It's also true that if you use punishment and you do effectively suppress a behavior, if you don't teach an alternative behavior, the individual may come up with an alternative. So, for example, you catch a child stealing and you punish that behavior effectively, but you don't replace it with another behavior like, here, I'm going to give you ways that you can earn money so you can go and buy the things you want. So if you don't have an alternative behavior in the wings, you may find that they continue stealing, but now they lie about it too. And so you end up with a problem that's worse than if you'd never intervened in the first place. And then finally, you can actually, with punishment, especially if it's used excessively, you can produce avoidance of the individual delivering the punishment. So you, as the intervention specialist, the parent, the teacher, whatever, you become a cue for punishment. When punishment is doled out non-contingently, frequently, escalates to abuse, when you start having all of these problems with punishment, the person delivering that punisher becomes a warning signal for aversive conditioning. And clients, children, students, spouses start to avoid that person. They will, you will see less affection, less spontaneous behavior, less playfulness. All of those things will be suppressed around that individual. There's even more. That's why I don't like punishment. If you use it too frequently, the subject can habituate to the punishers, and that causes the teacher, the parent, the intervention specialist to have to go to more severe consequences as time goes on. As the individual habituates, the punishment needs to become more intense, more aversive, more painful, and so it can escalate to abuse. You also need to know what's competing with your interventions. Is there rich reinforcement for continuing to engage in that unwanted response? Remember that most parents don't want to punish their children. And so when they do punishment, when they get angry enough, which is not the way you're supposed to do it, but when they get angry enough to punish the child, and they use spanking on their child, they shortly thereafter they feel guilty. And often they will shower that child with affection or with apologies. It's not unusual for a parent who has spanked a child to come back 10 minutes later and put the child on their knee and spend a lot of time explaining what the problem was and then doing sweet and loving things to them. And so, unfortunately, the children will learn that I get the most love and affection from my mom after she spanked me. Now, I'm not saying that they're conscious of this, but it has the effect of actually increasing the misbehavior because of that strong reinforcer that comes afterward. We see this in some cases of partner abuse where the victim will engage in low-level provocative behaviors because the reinforcers following the punishment are so powerful. Punishment can become a cue for reinforcement. We call it the abuser's honeymoon. After an abuse happens, the spouse will come back and with flowers and candy and gifts and tears, maybe emotions that are not displayed any other time, expressions of love and pleas not to leave, and relationship reinforcers that are actually kind of out of proportion and perverse. I mean, I can't remember the last time my husband pleaded with me not to leave because he never has. That's not a normal reinforcer for people in good healthy relationships. And so we have to be careful not to follow the punishment with reinforcements because it runs the risk of the individual unconsciously and unaware actually engaging in low-level behaviors. I don't know if any of you remember the movie Sleeping with the Enemy with Julia Roberts, but in the beginning it's a spousal abuse movie, and in the beginning of the film, she doesn't put the towels on the rack in the bathroom quite right. And you would think after you'd been abused several times that you'd get those behaviors right, but it's not uncommon for victims to unconsciously engage in those low-level behaviors because of the rich reinforcers on the other side. We even can get rats to press a lever to shock themselves if shock signals food. So a food-deprived rat is put in the presence of a lever that shocks them, and they will learn that the only way that they can get food is to be shocked. They'll actually press the lever themselves. So punishment is really, really hard to do correctly, and even then it still has side effects. So the conclusion is most behavior analysts will tell you that you use positive punishment as a last resort, that you try other methods first, as long as the target behavior isn't dangerous. Remember, you just read the article on the least restrictive alternative, and it sounds as though, when you read the article, that we should start with those interventions that produce the least amount of restriction on the individual, the least amount of the least amount of use of aversive stimulation whenever we can. However, when a target behavior is dangerous, for example, when it's dangerous to others or when it's dangerous to the individual, like self-injurious behavior, sometimes there is not a way to teach other behaviors until the behavior stops. So in a very small set of circumstances, punishment may be a first resort because it allows us to suppress those dangerous behaviors. But the truth is, most of the time in the real world, in the kinds of, even in the therapeutic environments that you will be working in, the use of punishment will not need to be a first line of defense. And you can try different kinds of positive reinforcement and token economies, and you'll be able to use lots of different interventions before going to punishment. And the level of punishment, you don't go to the most severe punishment, you start out lower, like they did with Harry, by removing his restraints for 2 minutes. that was aversive to him. And so you'll use negative punishment before you would use positive punishment. And it's only in those circumstances where you would have behaviors that are dangerous to the client or dangerous to others that you would consider using positive punishment as a first line of defense. You also need to remember that adding an explicit reinforcement contingency for specific appropriate alternative behaviors is critical. You need to have a training program for appropriate behavior ready to go so that when the undesired behavior stops, you can start teaching that other form of appropriate behavior. Never use punishment in anger. You need to choose your battles wisely. The use of punishment is very ineffective if you use it too frequently, so you want to reserve it for those circumstances that are really, really critical. And behaviors are difficult to suppress any other way. So you want to be careful. If you can avoid, remember that every time you choose punishment, you have to go through that list of side effects. Do I want the increased emotionality? Do I want aggression? Do I want avoidance of the punisher? Do you want all of those things as risks? And we want to avoid those side effects whenever we can. We don't want to produce a set of behaviors that are worse than the ones we're trying to get rid of. So it's best to avoid punishment whenever possible so that you can avoid the side effects. All right, I think that's going to do it for this lecture on punishment, positive punishment. We'll be back to talk a little bit about negative punishment, the use of timeouts and response costs and penalties. All right, have a good day.